The words were still in the air when she understood. She was standing in the hallway outside Nash's conference room, the one with the frosted glass panel, the one she had walked past 30 or 40 times without ever needing to stop, holding a thermos of chicken and dill broth she had made that morning at 4:30, because Nash had mentioned the week before that his stomach had been bad again. He hadn't asked her to bring it. He never asked. That had always been the thing about the way she loved him. It was entirely voluntary, entirely hers, and she had never once resented it. Until she heard his voice through the gap in the door. She comes by on Tuesdays. It's fine. It doesn't affect anything. His CFO, Marco, she recognized the voice, said something she couldn't make out, and then Nash. She knows the schedule. If she stops, she stops. Honestly, it's not something I keep track of. Sienna stood there with the thermos warm in both hands and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not rage. Not the particular collapse of a woman who has been loved carelessly. Something quieter and in its own way, more final. The sensation of a diagnosis delivered. The specific relief of a thing you have suspected for a long time being confirmed in plain language, so that you can finally, clearly stop wondering. She had her answer. The Tuesday soup had started 2 years ago in March, during a week when Nash was closing a development deal in River North that had gone 3 rounds past its original timeline and taken 2 of his project managers with it on the way. He had called her late on a Monday night, not to talk, just to exist in the sound of her voice while she closed the bakery, and mentioned, almost to himself, that he hadn't eaten anything since the previous afternoon. Not a complaint. Nash didn't complain. He stated facts the way he moved through a room, efficiently, without expecting any particular response. But Sienna had been watching her father starve himself at his desk for her entire childhood, and she had learned, in the way children learn the things that cost them later, that the men who said, "I'm fine" the loudest were the ones who most needed someone to not believe them. So she'd made the broth. Her grandmother's recipe: whole chicken, celery root, fresh dill, a piece of Parmesan rind, because her grandmother was Sicilian and could not be stopped. She'd driven 20 minutes through March slush to the downtown high-rise where Nash's firm occupied the top 2 floors, talked her way past a security desk staffed by a man named Roland, who looked at the thermos like it might contain a liability. She'd found Nash in his office, at 9 in the evening in his shirt sleeves, sitting across from a spreadsheet that had clearly been winning. He'd looked up at her, then at the thermos, then at her again. "You drove here," he'd said. "You haven't eaten," she'd said. He'd had 2 cups. He hadn't said much. She hadn't needed him to. She drove home in the slush with the empty thermos on the passenger seat and felt, for reasons she couldn't entirely name, like she had done something right. After that, it became Tuesday. Every Tuesday, for 2 years, through the renovation of her bakery's second dining room and Nash's acquisition of the lakefront property, and one very long winter when her daughter Mabel had been sick for 6 weeks straight, and Sienna had made the broth anyway, and Nash had eaten it at his desk and texted afterward, "Just good, thank you." And she had stood in her kitchen, rereading those 3 words until they meant something she could hold on to. She was not, and this was important to understand, a naive woman. She was 35 years old and had been running her own bakery since 29, the year she finished her culinary certification and her daughter's father finished his interest in being a father. She had built the business alone, rebuilt it once after a kitchen fire, raised Mabel in the apartment above it with secondhand furniture and a garden plot in the back where they grew tomatoes every summer, and talked about everything. She had edges. She had opinions. She had, on 2 separate occasions, told Nash to his face that he was being obtuse, which was the polite version of what she meant, and he had looked at her with something that might have been surprise and might have been respect, and ultimately had been both. She had not fallen in love with him because the power was exciting. There was no danger in Nash Varden, not in any way that made for a good story. He was simply a man who had grown up with very little and had decided, early and completely, that he would never be caught without enough again. That drive had become the whole of him, and somewhere in the 2 years they'd been together, it had also become the wall. She had noticed it the way you notice a house settling, not in any single crack, but in the accumulation of them. The Tuesday visits getting shorter. 40 minutes became 20, 20 became 10. Nash sending Roland downstairs with a message. He'll be another hour. She should head home. And she would leave the thermos with Roland and drive home through Chicago traffic and reheat it herself for dinner and not mention it, because mentioning it required naming it, and naming it required her to say out loud what she was beginning to know. That she had, in some essential way, become optional. The Tuesday she heard him, she had already been waiting 45 minutes. She had arrived at noon, as always, and sat in the lobby chairs and watched the foot traffic of people with somewhere to be. Roland had come down at 12:45, not to tell her Nash was on his way, but to apologize, carefully, the way he always apologized, with the particular care of a young man who understood that what he was delivering had weight, even if the person who sent him downstairs didn't seem to. He's in with Marco, probably another hour. I'll wait, she'd said. She'd meant it. She had been on her way back from the restroom on the second floor when she heard Nash's voice through the conference room door. The gap in the door was maybe 5 inches. She had not meant to stop. She stopped. She stood for a moment after the words settled. Then she walked back downstairs. She set the thermos on Roland's desk. She looked at him and said, "Make sure he gets that when he has a moment." She meant it. That was the part that surprised her later. She genuinely meant it. There was no drama in it, no performance, no final act. She just wanted him to eat something. That was who she was, and she wasn't going to stop being that person in the hallway outside his conference room. She pushed through the lobby doors into the February cold. She didn't go home. The apartment on Maple Street was a 10-minute walk from the bakery. She'd rented it 4 weeks earlier through a friend who worked in residential real estate and who had, to her credit, asked no questions and made no faces. 2 bedrooms, good light in the mornings, a radiator that knocked but held heat. She had moved things out of the house gradually, small things, 1 trip a week, so the rooms never looked suddenly wrong. Her grandmother's soup pot, the folder of Mabel's drawings she kept on the refrigerator door. A photograph of herself at 29, standing in front of the bakery on opening day, laughing at something her sister had said off camera. The laugh of a woman who had just done a terrifying thing entirely alone and discovered, in the doing of it, that she was capable. She'd already enrolled Mabel in a school 3 blocks from the new apartment. She'd already talked to her sister. She'd already done the math, which was the kind of math she'd been doing since she was old enough to understand that you had to know your numbers before the situation decided them for you. She went upstairs, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the window cracked to the February sound of the street below. It was quiet, not the quiet of the house she'd shared with Nash, where the silence felt like something she was accommodating. This was a different quiet, the kind that belonged to her. Nash came home at 9:40 that evening. He set his keys on the hall table the way he always did. He loosened his tie the way he always did. He walked through the house to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it without seeing anything he wanted. He went upstairs. He assumed Sienna had gone to bed early. The bakery started at 5. She was often asleep by 9. He was careful getting undressed, the particular practiced quiet of a man who had come home late enough times that the carefulness had become its own skill. He did not check the other side of the bed. By the 4th day, the house had begun to change in ways he couldn't name. It wasn't any single thing. It was the coffee that nobody made in the mornings. It was the small section of the refrigerator that had always held Mabel's yogurts and apple slices, standing empty. It was the drawing Mabel had left on the kitchen counter, a crayon rendering of Nash in a tall building with the words Mr. Nash printed in careful 7-year-old handwriting across the bottom, which had been there when Sienna left and was still there, untouched, because Nash had not known what to do with it and so had done nothing. Myra came in on Thursday morning and found Nash standing at the kitchen window with cold coffee in his hand, looking at the backyard, which contained nothing of particular interest. She set down her cleaning bag. She was 62 years old and had worked for Nash for 7 years and had in that time developed an understanding of what it cost a person to say certain things and what it cost a house when those things weren't said. She planned it, Myra said. Nash turned around slowly. Myra kept her hands clasped in front of her, which was the posture she adopted when she had decided something was going to be said, whether it was welcome or not. Sienna, she didn't leave because she was upset, not in the way you're thinking. She left because she had thought it through. The soup pot was the first thing, 3 weeks ago. Then the folder with Mabel's drawings, I noticed. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. She paused, but you should know she didn't go because of a bad week. She went because she was done. Nash set the coffee down on the counter. The drawing, he said, without looking at the counter where Mabel's crayon building still stood. She left that one, Myra said carefully. On purpose, I think. The silence in the kitchen had a particular quality, the kind that preceded things. Thank you, Myra, Nash said, with a quietness that she understood was a dismissal. She went. He stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. He looked at the drawing. The building was lopsided, the windows unevenly spaced, Mr. Nash written in the large block letters of a child who had recently learned that letters meant something. He looked at it the way he looked at things he didn't know how to file. He had never asked Mabel to draw him anything. She had done it entirely on her own and left it like a small, uncomplicated gift on the counter of a house she was being taken away from. The specificity of that, the unprompted generosity of a 7-year-old who owed him nothing, hit somewhere he hadn't expected. Marco found out where Sienna was through practical means. He came to Nash's office that evening without being called, which in 9 years of working together had happened precisely once before, and he stood in the doorway with an expression deliberately absent of apology. She's been opening the bakery every morning, Marco said. Same hours. She's fine. I know she's fine, Nash said. She looked, Marco stopped, started again. Someone saw her out front yesterday, talking to the woman who comes in every morning before open. She was laughing. She looked like she was having a completely normal day. Something moved through Nash's face, too quick to identify. He said nothing. Marco set a thin folder on the desk. Public business filing for the bakery. Equipment loan past due. The walk-in freezer. About $14,000. Thought you'd want the full picture. Thank you, Nash said. Marco left. Nash sat with the folder for a while. He read the filing the way he read everything, looking for the gap between what was stated and what was actually true. The gap here was a broken freezer and a bakery running on margins tight enough that one bad month would matter. He knew the exact nature of that gap because he had spent most of his adult life knowing precisely where the gaps were in any structure he was responsible for. He opened his laptop. He found the name of a small business development fund he quietly maintained, legitimate, properly filed. He spent 20 minutes with a calculator and the bakery's public revenue figures. Then he arranged an anonymous grant, not round, not symbolic. $14,430, the exact cost of a commercial walk-in freezer installed and running. He did not tell anyone. He wasn't sure he could have explained it if he'd tried. It wasn't strategy. There was a gap in something that mattered and he could fill it without anyone knowing it was him. And that felt, for reasons he would spend the next several weeks trying to understand, like the right size for what he was actually offering. Not grand, not a gesture. Just, there is a thing that needs doing and I can do it. And that is the whole of it. He found the note she'd left, folded, tucked inside the folder Marco had brought, in her handwriting, the kind that looked unhurried but covered ground fast. I'm not angry. I want you to know that first, because I know you'll read everything else through that lens if I don't say it first. I spent the last year trying to find the words for something simple. I needed to be seen, not managed, not accommodated, seen. Maybe that was always too much to ask. I don't think it was. I hope you take care of yourself. I mean that more than you'll believe right now. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He carried it there every day after that. He went to the bakery on a Wednesday morning. He told himself it was proximity. The office was nearby. He needed coffee. The place had good coffee, and he had been ordering from the chain on the corner long enough that even he found it tiresome. These were all true. They were also not the whole truth, which he understood and noted and set aside the way he set aside most things he couldn't immediately use. He ordered black coffee and sat at the small table by the window. He read documents on his phone. He did not look toward the kitchen. He came back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. The woman who worked the counter, Dorothea, 60s, quick and unhurried in equal measure, had the specific tolerance of someone who had watched enough people sit in coffee shop corners for complicated reasons to find it no longer remarkable. She refilled his cup without being asked and said nothing. On the fourth Wednesday, Sienna came through the kitchen door with flour on her hands and a tray of something that smelled like cardamom and brown butter, and she stopped when she saw him. The stop was complete. Not a step back, not a flinch. A total stillness, the kind the body falls into when it receives information faster than the mind can organize it. She stood with the tray in both hands and looked at him across 20 feet of bakery floor. He set down his phone. Nash. Sienna. The space between them had its own weather. How long, she said. Have you been coming here? 3rd week, he said. She looked at him steadily, the way she had always looked at him when she was deciding whether something was true. Not suspicious, exactly, but rigorous. She had always been rigorous. He had found it clarifying once. He had found it inconvenient later. He understood now which of those reactions said more about him. She carried the tray to the counter. She came back and stood at the edge of his table. The freezer grant, she said. Small Business Development Fund, public program. I looked it up. The fund doesn't do single-unit equipment grants under $20,000. He said nothing. You did math on my filing, she said. There was a gap, he said. Something in her expression shifted, not softening, exactly, but opening slightly the way a window does when someone has finally decided to let the air in. There's always a gap, she said. Come find me at close, she said. 6 o'clock. I want to talk. She walked back into the kitchen without waiting for his answer. The threat, when it came, arrived through 3 intermediaries in a forwarded message to Nash's personal number, a photograph taken from across the street of Nash sitting at the window table with his coffee. Underneath it, a name he recognized, a competing developer named Harlan Briggs, who had been circling the West Side corridor for 2 years. The message read, "Interesting place to spend your Wednesdays. The Maple Street corridor must be back in play. I'd love to catch up." Nash read it twice. He set his phone down and was very still for a long time. What moved through him during that stillness had edges. Not fear, exactly. He had moved through too many situations that should have frightened him to be easily frightened. But something adjacent to it. The specific weight of understanding that someone had aimed something toward a person who had nothing to do with the target. A bakery. A woman with flour on her hands. A child who drew crayon buildings and left them on counters as gifts. He called Briggs directly. He did not send a message, did not construct the layered approach he would normally use to neutralize something from a safe remove. He called, and Briggs answered, and Nash said, without greeting, "The woman in that photograph owns the bakery. She has no connection to any development on that corridor. If that changes in your understanding or in your communications, I will make the correction of that understanding very expensive for you. I'd like you to hear me say that directly." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Understood," he said. Nash hung up. He sat in the quiet of his office and thought about what he'd just done. Walked into a room with no strategy, no prepared position, nothing except the simple and non-negotiable fact that there was a line and someone had approached it. He had not calculated the angles. There were no angles. There was just her and the bakery and the complete impossibility of letting anything get near either of them. He had not known he felt that way until the moment he'd been required to. The holiday cookie giveaway happened every December. It had been Sienna's tradition since the bakery's second year. One Saturday morning, free cookies for every family in the neighborhood, plus brown bags of bread and pastry for anyone who needed it. She organized it herself, stayed up 2 nights before to bake, roped in Dorothea and her sister and whoever else she could find. Nash showed up at 7 in the morning with a delivery of supplies she hadn't asked for: flour, butter, good vanilla, enough to cover the overage she'd been mentally calculating for 3 weeks. He said he'd seen the flyer in the window. He asked if there was work to do. Dorothea looked at him, looked at Sienna, said nothing, which was, Sienna had learned, Dorothea's most eloquent register. Boxes, Sienna said, in the back. Sorted by type, cookies separate from bread. He sorted boxes for 2 hours. Then he ran deliveries. Then he swept. He did not make suggestions. He did not reorganize her system. He asked where things went and put them there and moved on. This was, she understood, not nothing. A man like Nash Varden did not naturally exist in rooms he hadn't arranged. The effort of not arranging it was visible, if you knew how to look. Mabel arrived at 10 with Sienna's sister. She had met Nash 3 times before Sienna left, and she was 7 years old, which meant her relationship to complexity was uncomplicated. She walked past him carrying a box of sprinkles, stopped, and said, "You sorted the cookies wrong. The snickerdoodles go with the sugar cookies, not with the gingerbread." "I didn't know that," Nash said. "Now you do," Mabel said, and kept walking. He fixed the snickerdoodles. Sienna, from across the room, watched him do it and felt something she did not have an immediate name for. Something small and careful, and, if she was honest, something that had been sitting in her chest for weeks, waiting for the right moment to declare itself. At 6 o'clock, when the last family had gone home and Dorothea had her coat on, and her sister had taken Mabel back to the apartment, Sienna turned off the front lights and found Nash still in the back room, stacking the empty boxes flat. She sat on the edge of the work table. He set down the last box and turned around. "The Tuesday I heard you," she said. "Tell me what you understood after." He didn't pause. "That I had said, out loud to another person, that whether you came or went was not something I kept track of." He held her gaze. "And that I had said it in the specific way a man says something he believes is true." She absorbed this. It landed the way truth lands when it confirms something you've carried quietly for a long time, not as a blow, but as a settling, a thing finally resting in the place it was always going to occupy. "It was true," she said. "That's what broke it, not the words. I know words come out wrong. What broke it was that I believed you immediately, because somewhere I had already known." "Yes," he said. 2 years of Tuesdays," she said, "and at some point I became the soup, something that showed up and was useful and would presumably keep showing up whether or not you looked at it." He didn't flinch from that. "Yes," he said again, "that is the accurate version." She looked at her hands for a moment, then at him, the grant, the boxes today, the Wednesday coffees. She almost smiled, not quite the beginning of one. "You did math on my financial filing. That is such a specific thing to do." There was a gap, he said, for what he recognized was the 3rd time. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." Outside, the December street had gone quiet. She reached into her apron pocket and took out a folded envelope. He recognized it, the return address of a family law office on the north side. She held it out. He took it. He looked at it without opening it, the weight of it in both hands. "Dunch," she said. "I've had them 6 weeks. My attorney is very patient." "Sienna!" "I told myself I was waiting to feel certain," she said, "but I think what I was actually doing was watching what you did when there was nothing in it for you, when there was no deal, no outcome, no strategic dimension, just boxes, just a freezer, just—" She stopped, started again, more slowly. "Just you, in the corner with your coffee, not asking for anything." He held the envelope. He thought about the thermos she'd left on Roland's desk, the last thing she'd done before walking out. Make sure he gets that when he has a moment. The specific generosity of a woman who had just been told She wasn't something he kept track of, and had still, on her way out the door, made sure he would eat. "I'm not going to tell you I've changed," he said. "I'm going to tell you that for the first time in my life, I understand what I failed to do and what that cost you. And I'm going to tell you that the Wednesday mornings aren't stopping regardless of what happens in this room. Not because I'm performing something. Because sorting boxes in a bakery at 7 in the morning is the first thing I've done in 15 years that I couldn't turn into a transaction." He paused. "I didn't know I needed that until Dorothea put me to work." She looked at him for a long moment. "One condition," she said. "Name it. If I become infrastructure again, if I become something you accommodate instead of someone you actually see, I need you to already know that I will leave again, and I will not wait 2 years the second time." "I know," he said. "Say it like you mean it." "I know," he said again, quieter, with a precision that had nothing performed in it whatsoever. She took the envelope back. She put it in her pocket. He let out a breath he had not fully known he was holding. They walked out into the December cold together, the bakery locked behind them, the street quiet in the way of Chicago on a Saturday evening when the day's business is finished, and the night hasn't fully arrived. She had her coat on, the gray wool one, slightly too large, which she had always preferred. He had his collar up against the wind. They didn't talk much. The block had its own sounds. Someone's front door, a dog somewhere, the distant warmth of a party in the building above the dry cleaners. They walked past the small park at the corner where Mabel had learned to ride her bike last spring, the one with the 2 bare trees that would bloom pink in April and fill the whole block for exactly 3 weeks before the petals fell. Sienna stopped at the park fence. She looked at the trees. "I used to bring Mabel here on the first warm morning every year," she said, "before the bakery opened, just to see if they were starting." Nash looked at the bare branches. "They look like nothing right now," he said. "They always do," she said, "and then they don't." He stood beside her in the cold. He did not reach for her hand. He thought about it, the old habit of it, the ease with which he had once taken that ease for granted, and he stopped himself, because the old habit belonged to the man who had turned her into something he didn't need to track. He was trying to build different ones. Then her hand was in his, not announced, not accompanied by eye contact or any change in the still December air, just her fingers finding his, the familiar weight of them, the specific way they settled that he had taken for granted and then lost and had not been certain he would ever feel again. He held on. They stood there for a while, looking at the trees that looked like nothing, in the particular cold of a city that did not care and did not judge, and simply continued. Indifferent and luminous, while 2 people stood at a park fence in December, figuring out whether what they had was still alive. It was. It was the most expensive thing either of them had ever kept. They walked home through the lit-up street, his hand in hers, her coat slightly too large, the city doing what it always did. "The soup," Nash said after a while. "What about it?" "I tried to make it 2 weeks ago, your grandmother's broth." She looked at him sideways. "I didn't know the dill ratio," he said. "It wasn't right." "I know," she said. "You left it on the counter Friday morning." He was quiet. "I drank it anyway," she said. He held her hand a little tighter. The cherry trees stood behind them in the dark, waiting in the long patience of things that know exactly what they're going to do come April, and are simply letting the cold finish what it needs to finish first.